The Ardennes was supposed to be quiet. That's what they told Lieutenant Jack Mercer when his battery rolled off the muddy road and into a beech grove near a village the map called Hofen. The trees were bare as broken ribs. Snow sifted down in whispers. In the distance, someone's mess tent clanged. Somewhere else, someone laughed like men do when they think the war is about to end and they'll go home with all 10 fingers. The last week of 1944 began like a lullaby. Then the horizon flashed. At 5:30 on December 16th, the east lit in sheets, strafing tracers, flares, and the throaty cough of heavy guns. The first salvos came in low and angry, hammering crossroads and telephone poles, shredding the field wires that connected Jack's 4 105mm howitzers to the forward observers perched across the tree line. "Christ," muttered Sergeant Dugan as a shell ripped a tree in half and howled the splinters across the snow. "They found us." Someone else said it couldn't be the Germans. Everyone said it was. By mid-morning, the radio nets were a bruise of panic. 106th Division reporting encirclement near the Schnee Eifel. 28th Division bending back on itself like wet cardboard. Infantry regiments calling for fire that never came because the net was jammed with voices and the sky pressed low and gray, hiding the Luftwaffe Stukas somewhere above like something in a bad dream. Jack crawled into the battery command post, a hole with a tarpaulin roof and a sketch of the valley pinned beside a coffee tin. Captain Black glanced up from the map with eyes that looked like 2 spent cartridges. "We hold this lateral road," he said. "If we lose it, they drive tanks straight to Eupen. If they get to Eupen, they get to Liège. If they get to Liège, we're out of Belgium," Jack finished. "Good man. Tell Dugan I want guns laid deflection 3-2-7-5, quadrant 410. Time on target full battery." "And Mercer?" Black hesitated. Then he pointed with his pencil to 4 long wooden crates stacked in the corner, still beaded with meltwater from the trip up. They were stenciled with navy gray letters and an Army secrecy stamp so thick it looked burned on. "Open those." Jack popped the first lid with his bayonet and folded the felt back. Inside lay a cylinder the color of dull pewter, threaded and perfect like a little machine that was somehow alive. A single sheet of instructions sat on top. It had 2 words in red: "Do not recover." "Proximity fuses," Black said softly. "VT, variable time. Radar in a nose cap. The Navy's been using them on AA guns since the Solomons." Somebody in SHAEF finally said, "We can try them on land." Jack had heard rumors. Shells that sensed the earth below and burst 10, 20 feet up inside the air where men lived and breathed, not inside the mud where the steel would be swallowed. He also knew the whispers. The Germans could copy anything that landed intact, so up to now they'd been forbidden in the ground war. But this was different. The Germans were in among the pines and the farmers' hedges, moving in close-order columns because the roads were clogged. They were betting on weather to blind American planes and on surprise to break American lines. What if the sky itself could be turned against them? "Orders are to test on massed infantry only," Black added. "No grazing fire on tanks. No airbursts over towns. You don't document it. You don't talk about it over radio. You just use them when you see helmets bunched like acorns." He handed Jack a wax tag. It said simply, "Issue by hand. Account for every fuse. Destroy duds." By noon, the fog thickened into a wall. The first German assault came at 13:10. Ghosts in snow capes. The muzzles of their MP-40s black commas as they drifted between trunks. The forward observer, Lieutenant Sloan, breathed into his handset. Target infantry in the open. Grid 244. Danger close. There was a pause that tasted like copper. Then Jack did what he had been taught in a Pennsylvania pasture with wooden guns. He made the arithmetic of violence. Elevation, azimuth, powder charge, powder temperature, air density. He spoke numbers. The men answered with motion. A ballet of brutality, breech blocks clacking, powder bags thumped. Shells kissed with the new gray noses. "VD up," Dugan shouted, almost reverently. "Fire." The first salvo stepped out across the snowy floor and climbed into the gray. Nothing moved. The world inhaled. The shells sensed the return of their own whisper of radio waves off helmets and snow and sap. Then the air popped in a chain of flat white flowers. Pa pa pa, 20 feet over the German line, showering the woods with steel rain. The effect was obscene and immediate. Men went down without obvious wounds, knocked flat by pressure and pellets. Whole files broke like rotted rope. Someone screamed in German, high and close, and then the screaming cut off. Repeat, Jack heard himself say. His voice sounded like it came from another man. Fuse setting, VT repeat. Guns barked, the air blossomed again. Where a minute earlier white shapes had seemed to advance like snowfall, now the ground folded back on itself like a sheet being shaken out. The attack dissolved. The radio net, still a bruise, still a buzz, filled with a new tone that Jack later recognized as hope. Up the lateral road they held. Beyond the beech grove, someone reported that American engineers blew a bridge right in the face of a panther. On another net, a colonel in Bastogne crackled. Nuts, and the word moved like a talisman through circuits and blood. That night the crate sat lighter by 2 layers. The battery slept in shifts. When he finally closed his eyes, Jack dreamed of fireflies that winked in time with the beating of his heart. The next days were a whirl of snow and math. The Germans sent panzers down every road that would bear them. They pushed hard at Elsenborn Ridge, the last high ground that mattered east of Liège, and at a crossroads called St. Vith, and around Bastogne where the 101st Airborne dug into the frozen earth and dared the encirclement to do its worst. The weather clamped down so close that airplanes might as well have been birds in another universe. The American army had to fight blind, and when you fight blind, you fight by ear and instinct and the feel of your own hands. And artillery in that winter was not just guns. It was system. Miles of copper wire, young lieutenants with prismatic compasses, the new habit called fire direction centers that could add the weight of 3 battalions in minutes, and a devilish trick named time on target. Rounds from guns scattered across counties, all arriving within a heartbeat. This secret weapon wasn't only a fuse. It was the way the Americans had learned to throw steel with choreography. But the fuse, those dull, pewter noses, changed the angle of the blade. On the 4th day, the weather thickened to a woolen dark. A lull settled, sinister. Jack stood by number 2 gun and watched soldiers from an armored infantry company plod past, their faces gray with frost and exhaustion. One paused, a private with a scar that made him look perpetually skeptical. He tapped the nose of a waiting 105 millimeters round with a gloved knuckle. That new? He asked. Jack nodded. The private grinned. Make it snow on him, he said, and trudged on. At dusk, the Germans tried again, this time preceded by a mortar deluge that made the tree trunks spray needles like fountains. Jack's forward observer called corrections like a metronome. Add 100, left 50. Fire for effect. The battery obeyed, and VD did the rest. The shells looked almost delicate, bursting in air. White explosions like dandelions. Pretty until you realized each petal was a sliver of steel traveling faster than a fastball. The German infantry, already packed by their officers for the final push, scattered, then bunched again, then stopped bunching at all. Afterward, Jack found a helmet in the snow. It had a neat hole through the crown and no blood beneath. He turned it over in his hands until his fingers went numb, and he realized he was shaking not from cold, but from the understanding that something had shifted. The balance of the offensive had hinged on weather and surprise. The weather still belonged to the Germans. Surprise no longer did. On December 23rd, the sky finally cracked open like a frozen window, broken from the inside. Sun spilled onto the white world, and Allied fighter bombers came swarming. Thunderbolts and typhoons snarling at columns trapped in valley roads. Mustangs lancing wagon trains. C-47s dropping bundles of food and morphine and hope over Bastogne. Men stood in their foxholes and cheered at airplanes the way farmers cheer at rain after a drought. It wasn't the end, but you could see the shape of the end, and it did not look like defeat. That night, Captain Black scribbled a note by flash lamp. VT effective. Infantry assault broken at 300 meters. Morale up. Ammo down. He tucked it into his breast pocket with a photograph of a woman in a red dress. Then he turned to Jack. "Tomorrow," he said, "we'll push them back. We'll make the bulge a bruise that fades." Jack lay awake staring at the tense ridgepole. He thought about the strange fuses and the crate's warning and the way the air itself had become a weapon. He thought of the private with the skeptical scar and the way the men cheered at airplanes. Mostly he thought of the silence after a salvo, the little grace before the cracking blossoms. It sounded like breath being drawn. It sounded like a world preparing to change. Outside, the trees made a sound like paper torn slowly. Somewhere to the south, Bastogne still held. The crates were almost empty. To be continued. Part 2. The air that kills and the silence that saves. On Christmas morning, the Ardennes looked like a postcard from a peaceful country. Smoke rose in thin blue threads. The fields were blank and clean. Beneath that beauty lay broken tracks, burned fuel trucks, and men who had learned how fragile a human body is in 20 below wind. Somewhere, a chaplain read from Luke. Somewhere else, a platoon boiled snow in helmets and called it coffee. At 8:10, the Germans came again. They came because that was the plan and because pride permits no smaller plan. Folks grenadiers in white smocks stalked the tree leans. Panzer grenadiers crowded half-tracks that coughed and stalled on ice. King Tigers ground forward like moving bunkers, mufflers coughing dark phlegm into the cold. They came with orders that since Antwerp had not been taken in a week, it must be taken in 2. They came with the faith of men who had once been unstoppable and could not bear the memory of being anything else. Jack's forward observers tracked them like hunters in a fog forest. Numbers traveled from tree line to wire, from wire to plotting board, from plotting board to breach. Time, distance, powder, wind, VT. The battery fired. The air bloomed. The air killed. Here is what the proximity fuse did that day, and the day after, and the day after that. It punished the basic fact of infantry, that men must sometimes move together. It found a moment when a squad crossed a fence line, when a platoon clambered a ditch, when a company stepped from shadow in a half-light. It made the safest instinct wrong. Get low had always saved lives. Now steel bloomed above prone bodies and showered them with fragments, finding necks and shoulders that helmets couldn't hide. The old mathematics of crawling and hugging trees changed. In after-action notes, scrawled with a pencil that kept freezing, an American major wrote, "They do not know where to put themselves." On the ridge near Elsenborn, American artillery massed like thunderheads. Infantry hugged the reverse slope, out of the line of German guns, but close enough to counterattack. Every time the German infantry crested the skyline, American observers called for airbursts. Battalions fired together, fused together, and entire snowfields turned briefly into something like weather, sheets of white sparks drifting down. The German momentum, so precious, so hard-won, broke like a wave against a seawall. To the south, in Bastogne, the 101st spent Christmas surrounded, eating chocolate and roasted horse, sending out patrols with boots wrapped in burlap. For them, the secret weapon wasn't the fuse. It was time bought by artillery and engineers and luck, time that walked around the foxholes on December 23rd wearing wings and dropping parachutes full of plasma, gasoline, and 75mm howitzer shells. The Germans shelled the town. The Americans shelled back. And when German infantry massed in the crooked streets, airbursts over the orchards cut their ranks into fragments. On the 26th, a spearhead from Patton's Third Army punched a thin green corridor into the siege, and Bastogne breathed again. There's a photograph from those days, a first sergeant in a parka standing beside a 105 with a cigarette stuck to his lip, eyes slitted against powder smoke. On the ground are 2 fused tins empty. His expression is not triumph, it is work. The secret weapon worked because men did. By New Year's, the German attack had slowed to a crawl. Fuel convoys burned. Half-tracks lay nose down in ditches like dead horses. Frostbitten teenagers from Folks Grenadier divisions surrendered with their white smocks stained the color of rust. The Luftwaffe made a last convulsive lunge on January 1st. Operation Bodenplatte, that smashed airplanes on Allied fields but bled out what strength remained in German fighter groups. The weather stayed clear. The proximity fuse did its quiet arithmetic, and the American artillery kept time like a drummer no one saw. One afternoon, with the battery displaced forward 2 miles, Jack climbed a knoll to look east. In the bowl of the valley below, Germans were falling back along a narrow road. Wagons and men bunched in the urgency that comes when you realize you're late to your own survival. He adjusted his binoculars and saw officer silhouettes moving like punctuation marks, arms windmilling, trying to scatter their people into trees. He took a breath that fogged the glass and got on the wire. Fire mission, he said. Grid 322. Infantry and vehicles in column. VT, 6 rounds gun. Battery, when ready. The fire direction center read his voice and saw what he saw. 6 minutes later, his battery and 2 he'd never met spoke together. The shells arrived in the sweet, cruel cadence of a time-on-target strike. 1 heartbeat, then detonation everywhere at once. The first wave of airbursts shredded the head and tail of the column, so it could not move. The second wave walked back and forth along the trapped length like a man mowing a lawn. When the smoke thinned, the road was a bristle of broken things pointing in all directions at once. Jack lowered the glasses and felt nothing for a long minute. Not pride, not pity, just emptiness, huge and pale as the sky. He opened his mouth, and the cold bit his teeth, and somewhere deep in his memory, he felt the fingernail of guilt scratching at a door. Do not recover. And then behind that guilt, something steadier answered. We did not start this. We will end it. And ending it looks like this. That night a runner brought a message written on onion skin. From 1st Army to Corps/Devarty/Arty groups. Subject: use of VT fuses. The note authorized what practice had already proven. Broader employment when infantry bunched. Priority to choke points. Strict destruction of duds. No mention of the fuse by name on radios. If history is a machine, here was one of its gears catching. Word on German, Netz told a parallel story. Artillery with new timed fuses is causing heavy losses, a regimental diary noted. Our men avoid open ground even when ordered. On another sheet, an officer scrawled Luftlage schlecht, air situation poor, and underneath it, artillery übermächtig, artillery overpowering. In private, some panzer commanders started calling American airburst Hagel, hail that fell only on them. In early January, the Bulge bent back. American corps attacked like slowly closing jaws. North of Bastogne, the 2nd and 99th Divisions shoved the Germans off Elsenborn Ridge for good. South of the salient, Patton's divisions pushed north, their tank destroyers slewing sideways on glare ice to fire. By mid-month, the two jaws met near Houffalize, and the map looked mostly like it had in early December, except for the scars, the smudged forests, the blackened villages, the thin, empty faces of civilians who had imagined history might pass them by and been wrong. On the day the salient finally closed, Jack stood beside his gun and looked at the last of the dull pewter noses. Dugan was inventorying, lips moving as he tallied. Hell of a thing, the sergeant said. A little can with a brain. It isn't the only thing, Jack said. Dugan snorted. No, but turned the air against him. That night, as snow began again, Captain Black gathered the battery in the CP. He took out the picture of the woman in the red dress, stared at it for a time, and tucked it back. You'll hear people say the weather-breaking won it, he said. They won't be wrong. You'll hear them say Patton won it, or the paratroopers in Bastogne, or the guys who didn't break on Elsenborn. They won't be wrong either. Me? I think we won it with system, with radios and wire and FDC math and the way a dozen battalions learned to breathe together. And we won it with one little secret the Germans never solved. He held up the last fuse between thumb and forefinger. In the lamplight, it looked like a toy, like something a kid would spin on a table to pass time. We'll use these again, he said softly. Kawasaki in the Pacific. Bridges, beaches, everywhere men think the ground is their friend. We've made the air the enemy. The men were quiet. Outside, a jeep backfired. Somewhere far away, a church bell counted 10. After the war, Historians would argue about what broke the German army in the Ardennes. Some would say fuel. Others would say Allied air power once the weather cleared. Others would point to ultra intercepts and to Hitler's own stubbornness, to the Allied decision to hold key road centers at any cost, to the deep doctrine of American artillery that made every gun on the front available to any fight. All of them would be right. Wars seldom hinge on one lever. But ask the men who stood in the tree lanes that month what felt different, what turned an onrushing white tide into a spray of broken foam, and many would say, the air started bursting. Ask the Germans who crawled into the snow with orders to take a hill and found that hugging the ground was no longer safety, but trap, and they would say something similar in words they didn't have in their language yet. The sky itself had become treacherous. Years later, Jack Mercer would take his grandson to the museum at Aberdeen and point to a little gray cylinder behind glass. That, he would say, was a secret once. It's just a thing. But sometimes the right thing arrives in the right hands at the right hour, and that hour is the hinge the world swings on. The boy would press his nose to the glass and squint. It's small, he'd say, disappointed. Jack would nod. So are snowflakes, he'd say. But put enough of them together, they stop an army. And sometimes, here he would think of a beech grove, of blossoms of white fire falling from a low sky, of a note that said, "Do not recover," of men cheering at airplanes. Sometimes they save one. Outside the museum, the sky would be clean and bright, and Jack would tip his face up into it, not with fear, but with gratitude, remembering the winter when the air became a weapon and the weapon helped end a war.